Welcome back to Analysis. In the first part of the programme, we looked at the crisis in the Parkview School in Birmingham, but now we're going to widen out the debate to have a look at what's happening with faith schools in general. My guests from the first part of the programme are still with me, and we're going to be joined in this part by Paul Pettinger, National Coordinator for the Accord Coalition. But first, let me go back to Maurice Coles. Maurice, do you think that in some way what's happening with the government policy is that it's kind of privatising a section of education, but the direction it's going in isn't really suiting it ideologically?
Well, the government's agenda has always been one of downsizing of local authorities, privatise as far as you can. And that they appear, and I say appear, they appear to be happier in all areas, bar the areas of Muslim schools. Because they've almost believed their own hype about Muslim extremists and so on and so forth. And you can't have it both ways. I mean, this is one of the paradoxes. You can't say, well, let's have a free school movement and let's drive every school down the academy route and give them all sorts of freedom. And then suddenly, oh no, well, all you guys can be free, but we're a bit concerned about freedom for Muslims. And so I think you're right. It's not suiting them particularly well.
So, Gus, do you think what it is a kind of education version of Henry Ford's saying that, any colour you like as long as it's black? The government wants to give freedom of choice, but it doesn't actually like the outcomes unless it's in line with what it prefers ideologically.
Well, yes, I mean, it seems to me that the government has never really decided what its position is on faith schools. Every time it has an opportunity to look at this thing sensibly and in some depth, it fudges the issue. And what Maurice was saying is absolutely right, of course. You can't have a situation where you're saying to people, you have freedom to establish schools. If you're very successful, you can extend that success by taking on other projects, particularly schools that are weak, and then turn around and say, well, we will get worried if that opportunity is used by Muslims. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. More than that, it is singularly discriminatory.
To hear, Alan, I mean, you were saying, that your school has got caught in this paradox, even though you were saying in the first part of the programme it's not a faith school. So, I mean, how do you feel about that? Do you feel that what's happening really is that one part of the sort of ideological agenda of the government is now kind of, distorting the reality that you're actually involved in on the ground?
I mean, we actually, from the outset, we are kind of a success story of the government. We were a small state school, and we're a very high-performing school. We actually worked with the Department for Education, and we were given 2 more schools to sponsor, a primary school to sponsor, which we worked the Department for Education with, and a secondary school. Both of those schools, actually, within less than a year, we improved both of those schools to the highest attainment levels they've ever had in their history. And that was our success rate, really. So it comes as a greater shock to us that although we are part of the government policy in that sense, really, that something was not liked somewhere, really, particularly driven by media and so on. But I think the mantra of parental choice, really, is one that is bandaged around rather a lot, actually, by this government, and indeed by previous governments as well. But I think the governments are not comfortable, actually, with letting go of education, if you like. Making it an enterprise and developing it and so on. They do want to take power away from local authorities, but they want to retain the control at the same time as well. And there's a lot more prescription coming in, for example, in relation to academies. You're supposed to have more freedoms, but what we find is that there are greater stipulations actually coming in through the inspection framework, through the academy regulations, which actually are, giving freedom hand and taking it away from the other. But there's a great deal of discomfort, I think, around Muslims actually influencing, I suppose, the education of their own children. And if parental choice is to be important, then that should be valued for everybody, regardless of whether they're Christian, Muslim, atheist, agnostic, or whoever you are. Allow people to have a say in the education of their own children.
Maurice, I mean, do you think that the government should let control go of the education system, because it isn't one of the things that's happening here that, you know, whatever you think about it, an economy like this needs a sort of standard basis of education, and that what the government is constantly finding is that when it lets go of this, it's in danger of not being able to provide that, so it has to come back in through the back door and reimpose it.
Yeah, this is a perennial question, isn't it, really? I remember when I first started teaching many years ago, people said, oh, we mustn't have politics in education. Well, because education has always been about the allocation of scarce resources, it is by definition political in its framework. The problem with this government is that the various checks and balances that were previously in place, and the initiatives that came from things like the qualifications of the QCA and other innovative bodies, they have removed all those. And here's quite right, there's nothing left now between central government and its chill wind and the schools themselves. And there's no way that any one government can actually control all the schools in the country. Professor Mick Waters, in his book, Thinking Aloud, actually talks about having a national commission for education, which will be full of people of various backgrounds and various things, but will be outside of politics. And after the experience we've had with the last sort of 4 years with Michael Gove, I think that may be the best way forward. Okay, you've got to be accountable to Parliament and so on and so forth. You've got to have checks and balances. But at the moment, to be honest, John, I think it's one hell of a mess.
I agree.
Well, Gus, yeah. So describe what the mess looks like from your point of view.
Well, I mean, the mess is this. We send our children to school because we're compelled to, unless you can demonstrate that you've got arrangements for them at home that meet the criteria the government sets. And once that happens, you don't really have very much control over what schools do. I mean, I admire what Irfan does, but I disagree with his thesis about academies and the powers that they have or do not have. I want to see a locally elected body of people take responsibility for my child's education, allocation of places, admissions policies and how they're applied, and issues around special educational needs, the manner in which the curriculum is organized and delivered so that teachers are given the space to concentrate not just on what children need to know, but how they should be. So all of those things, it seems to me, are critical. Now, if you have one body of people, let me put my cards on the table. I am against academies. I am even more against free schools, all right? So if you have a body of people discharging these particular functions who are not accountable to anybody, they're not elected by anybody, and they could choose to do A, B, C, X, Y, or Z by virtue of what they themselves determine and the ethos they want to build, which might not have anything to do with equity or with the human rights, despite the legislation, then ordinary parents could exercise very little power in relation to all of that.
So what you're arguing for really is a kind of democratized version of the old local education authorities, or not? Is that have I got you right?
No, yes, and in that sense, as Mick Walters has suggested, a body of people who can take all of this away from the capriciousness of particular secretaries of state for education. I mean, it beggars belief that a Michael Gove can be running education in this country.
Paul, what do you reckon about that? I mean, I think that perhaps many people listening to that will think, they'll look at what Gove's doing, they'll look at that suggestion and say, well, maybe that's one way out of this mess.
We have a tension, I think, in the education system. At the moment, we have choice as a key driver, and we've had it for 10 years. And a consequence of that is greater segregation, is schools doing different things. And I think the government has been irresponsible in recent years in not being more proactive in trying to inspect schools. I mean, you have introduced more issues there about the education system. I would certainly argue that it's been irresponsible that we are allowing much greater choice and freedom for schools, and at the same time we are reducing the frequency of inspection. We've reduced the criteria that Ofsted inspect schools on. So they were supposed to, up until 2011, inspect on how they promoted community cohesion, for example, which is now gone. So actually, I think the pendulum has swung towards choice. Actually, the government haven't really woken up to lots of the issues that come from those arrangements.
Maurice, what do you make of that? Because I mean, I guess one way of sort of putting the point that Gus was making there is that, you know, you've now got a paradox where you've got a very localised version of choice, but a very heavy-handed national administration trying to correct the errors of choice, if you like. I guess what Gus was saying is that a more democratic and broad-based version of guiding the education system at a local level would be a way out of that paradox.
Yeah, I agree entirely with Gus as far as that's concerned. And you know, when you look back to the balance and the measure, to echo first point I made, of the 1944 Education Act, you know, the Butler Act, then all that's actually disappeared, and it's been eroded over a period of time where local accountability counts for less and less, and of course local funding counts for less and less. So. And I know I've had email correspondence with Professor Tim Brighouse latterly in relation to the whole Trojan horse saga. And I was saying that in our day, as it were, when I worked for Tim, we'd have probably called all the schools together, we'd have reassured them, we'd have given them our support, and we'd have said quite clearly that, you know, if this letter proves to be true, then the full force of what we can do would actually come down upon the governors. And we knew it was right from the start, it was a hoax. So I think we've got to move back to a much fairer system. Because, I mean, if I were a parent and of children going to school now, I mean, how the hell do you begin to choose? It's just, yes. It's so complicated. And and to whom do you turn when there's a problem?
Yeah, let me bring to here. I mean, because you've had a success story in this, but do you sympathise with that point? Because I think anybody who's talked to a parent about where they're sending their school, I mean, you practically have to have a degree in school selection to make the choice. Never mind about the wait to actually get your kid into the school that you might decide is best for them.
Well, I think the idea of choice actually is quite a fallacy. I think vast majority of people, unless you're very affluent and so on, and you can pay some money. The vast majority of parents do not have a choice as to where their children go. They just go to the school, nearest school maybe where they are, or maybe a little further, which might be under-subscribed school or something, might be a good school or whatever. So there's very little choice actually, certainly in Birmingham and certainly in most inner city situations. So there isn't that choice because, you know, there's shortage of places in most major cities. So it's a fallacy to say there is actually a choice. Nonetheless, what we found actually, our school actually, after the grammar schools in Birmingham and one faith school in Birmingham, because of the success story actually in that sense, parents want, you know, good academic achievement, they want good ethos, good character development within the school. And if any school has that, the parents will actually queue up to send their children. That's what we had at our school. We were a very oversubscribed school in spite of being in a very deprived area and all the other issues to do with that. So parents want high academic standards and they want to ethos in the school, regardless of whether they're Muslim, Christian, and whoever they are. But unfortunately, the choice is not there, whether you speak free schools or academies. And I agree with the two other colleagues of mine here that, there's a balance to be struck, I suppose, in terms of accountability. I think that it's important that schools are accountable to the communities they serve, i.e. a local accountability framework of some description. But the difficulty has been, to be honest with you, over the last 2 decades that I've been in education, in governance, in inner city schools, trying to transform schools, that so many schools actually have failed decade in, decade out in the local setup, if you like, in the local authority setup. And nobody has intervened. Nobody has issued any warning notices. Nobody has used any powers to actually say, look, your results have been so poor for a decade. Something needs to be done. So there have been failures on that side, actually, as well, which are kind of swinging the pendulum the other way, if you like, towards academies, which, of course, I quite agree that they are less accountable and they should be accountable locally from my point of view.
Paul, do you think that if we were rewriting this, because the point that T is making there is that people really want good education for their kids, and other questions, not surprisingly, are secondary, perhaps even including faith.
Sure, yes. Well, we have to deal with the education system that we have. Obviously, a third of state-funded schools in England are faith schools, and that's largely a legacy from the fact that the churches were there before the state. Providing education, so we have to work with the history that we have. But I do think, as I said earlier, that the state has been irresponsible. I met with a range of DfE officials yesterday and raised a number of concerns around particularly faith schools breaking the admissions code, around the issue of gender segregation at some schools, and the continued response was it was us to prove that these things were happening because they want to allow market forces to drive, as they see it, innovation and improvement. And actually, I don't think it's working. I question whether that is appropriate for education in itself. And if you embark on those kind of reforms, I think surely we should have greater inspection rather than less.
Gus, what do you make of the whole question, which has come up in relation to the Birmingham school, the whole question of gender segregation? Because, I mean, anybody who's been through the school system in the last 50 years, it's enough to make a cat laugh, isn't it? Because, I mean, I went to an all-boys school. There was an all-girls school on the other side of the campus. There was literally a line down the middle of the playing field. I mean, whatever might be an issue here, it certainly isn't simply only a Muslim question, is it?
Absolutely. And that model, the British exported to all sorts of places, including the country that I came from. And it doesn't really begin to deal with issues around differential levels of achievement of boys and girls and all of those sorts of structured and structural issues. I mean, I think it's frankly, in the context of Parkview, a red herring. It introduces all sorts of other stuff too, as far as Islam is concerned, which isn't particularly helpful. In other words, the government rushes headlong into these things without too much thought. This country has got some of the most able education academics of anywhere that I know, dotted around universities all around the land. They are totally capable, particularly given the research that we do and everything else, of sending messages to government. And we do. When I leave here, I'm going to something that Professor Peter Mortimer will be speaking at the House of Commons later. The fact is that nobody listens. And they get in their little cabals within the DfE or whatever it is, and dreams up these things, or some Secretary of State has a bath and has a brainstorm, and then next day it turns into policy. That's not a way to run education in any country. And my point is this, that they do not join the dots. You don't look to see what are the implications of pursuing this particular ideology, the marketization of education, for social cohesion, for reducing discrimination, for making education for all and every child matters a reality. If you don't attend to those things and see what impact your policies are going to have on these aspirations, then you're in very serious trouble. Because we're not dealing with a common starting point of everybody. Tahir mentioned people who have money and could make choices. That's absolutely right. In the same high-performing school, you might find parents able to spend 40, 60 pounds an hour on extra tuition in whatever subject for their children, and others are on free school meals and could hardly buy the uniform to send children to school. So it's absolutely stupid to think that you can marketize something like schooling and education.
Okay. Maurice, well, luckily this show goes out after the Watershed, so the prospect of Michael Gove in the bath that Gus just raised there is safe for viewers. But do you feel that under Gove there's been an increase in this kind of meddling that you hear repeatedly from teachers and others?
It's not meddling; it's control. And I think Gus and others have actually raised the point that that actually everything at the end of the day is controlled by the Secretary of State himself. And this was always inherent within the various education reform acts. In fact, I remember, I think it was 1988, and Kenneth Baker, when somebody once said, well, supposing Ken Livingstone becomes Secretary of State. Well, we've got our own Ken Livingstone in the form of Michael Gove, just a different persuasion. And what he's done, therefore, and I was very involved in commenting and criticising the national curriculum programmes, very much against his notion of EBAC, very much against his change to the examination system so that it's actually one throw of the dice at the end of a period and so on, and all the things that many educationalists, and Gus is right, we've got some of the best in Europe, have actually campaigned for years, have within 4 years been completely removed, including, although the duty of schools to promote community cohesion is still there, it's not off statute books, it's not inspected, so it's well down the list. Spiritual, moral, social and cultural development, which is part of statute, which is in the national curriculum, is there, but it's not particularly, Gove's not interested, so it's not looked at with any real detail and so on and so forth. So what you've got actually is a hugely centralised onto one person system, which is profoundly dangerous.
Okay, Paul, just the last comment before we close the programme. I can't remember an education secretary who is as unpopular as Michael Gove. Do you think he can survive in the job?
He's trying to pick a fight with many people. I think a key weakness in his education programme is that he's inherently suspicious of teachers. He sees them as representative of producer interests, which I think is crazy because almost all teachers go into it because it's the profession for them. I think that he has the support of his colleagues, but he's very unpopular with teachers.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. That's the end of this episode of Analysis, but I'd like to thank my guests and, of course, you at home for watching. Please tune in again for future discussions. And don't forget, you can keep up with the discussion by following us on Twitter at the address below or by following the Islam Channel Current Affairs on Facebook. Until next time, goodbye.